Hi guys, how are you doing?
Good.
Good.
Good morning.
Awesome. So maybe we can just start off with some quick intros. Yeah, maybe Curtis, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Curtis McKee. I'm a partner at Third Point Ventures. We're an early stage venture fund, part of Third Point, which is a large New York hedge fund, investing in B2B enterprise, mostly A to B, and lead checks, take board seats, and we try to be very technical and be very involved as a board member.
Kelly Grazade, co-founder and general partner of F7 Ventures. We're an early stage pre-seed seed fund. Today we're investing out of a $50 million vehicle. I think we're a little smaller than the others that I share the stage with, but it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Hey everyone, my name is Namdi Regblom. I'm a partner at Lightspeed Venture Partners. We're a 20-year-old plus venture firm, now multi-stage, investing out of a $7 billion set of vehicles as of our last fundraise across enterprise, consumer, fintech, healthcare, etc. And I focus on enterprise investments.
Morning, everybody. My name is Vivek Ramaswamy. Not the presidential candidate. I've gotten that a lot, but I'm not the same guy. But I'm a partner at Madrona, which is a venture and growth fund. We have offices in the Bay Area and Seattle, been around for close to 30 years now. Invest basically seed to Series C, mostly focused on B2B software, application data infrastructure, lead checks, and excited to be here.
Awesome. Thanks again, folks, for coming and joining us here today. So, I just want to begin by talking a little bit about what Ray touched on, which is we've seen the market shift a lot over the last couple of years. Lower valuations, more measured investing, the bar's gone up, which means, fewer great deals in market, and still, the competition's sort of increased. So I'm curious to hear from your perspective, how has this market dynamic, impacted your sourcing strategy? Are there things that you're doing differently now, especially in the vein of being data-driven, or otherwise that you're thinking about that you weren't thinking about, a couple years ago? And maybe we'll start with you, Vivek.
Yeah, sure. So I think definitely the environment has changed. If I think about like the different periods we had, this 2020 to 2022, which was this really crazy period of deal making, and you can see how many companies got funded and the kind of valuations that we saw in those 2 years, and then 2022, 23 so far this year we've seen a dip. The interesting thing is, I'd say there's almost like a tale of two cities, right? There's most kind of mid to late stage investing, which has generally been softer than the last couple of years. But at the same time, early stage AI and even some of these really hot AI companies, the market's as hot as it's ever been. So I think the important thing for us is as you mentioned, like always being data driven as much as we can, but not letting us use that to crowd out what are, we think are going to be really good investments. And so, I think in every sort of, analysis we do, we just are a lot more, we put a lot more importance around what are the true exit valuations here, right? Given where the market is today, what do we think these companies have a realistic chance to become? And, whether it's AI or something else, I think we're more diligent probably as a community than we were a few years ago, which I think is a really good thing.
Two things for us. So we are a venture firm founded by operators. Each of us have long-standing operating careers. The name comes from, we spent many years, the early days of Facebook. So 95% of the founders that we invest in are former operators. And so some things haven't changed in that we start those conversations very early. We're talking to really talented individuals essentially when they're thinking about making that move to the founder seat. And we take that responsibility very seriously to help them think through what makes sense. At the same time, I think what's maybe interesting about us as a firm and a brand is that we're relatively new. This has really been built over the last few years. So at the same time, we're seeing this influx essentially of cold outreach and inbound. And one of our missions in starting this firm was really about access and creating an equal starting line. So we've put a lot in place, and actually with the help of Affinity, to make sure that we're capturing that. We have a data-driven scoring mechanism for everything that comes in, and then we essentially use Affinity to help track What do we look at? What goes to a GP meeting? What moves to diligence? What's a fit? What do we follow up with later? And as a small firm, we've really had to be thoughtful about using that kind of data and scoring, thinking about the tool sets we're using so that we can really sort of fulfill both of these mechanisms, from those bespoke conversations with operators and fielding the increasing volume that's coming in as a small firm.
I can jump in. So I think what it's allowed us to start conversations earlier with founders. We tend to be a post-product market fit investor, which tends to be in the Series B stage, but Series A also is becoming a more mature area for us to, with the companies a bit more mature from a recurring revenue cohort of customers will engage. But what it's allowed us is to get more involved earlier, perhaps at the seed stage of the company, just to start building relationships. Because since we're seeing that capital has been slower to deploy since 2022, it just allows us to be even more thoughtful and to be more engaged early on, to get to know the team, the founders, the tech. That's your point of view.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is sort of continuing along the lines of the tale of two cities that Vivek was mentioning, especially within the context of AI. I wouldn't say our sourcing strategy has changed so much as the intensity has picked up in that context, in part because these deals are moving so quickly, but also in part because the types of individuals that are spinning out and starting these AI companies, I think, is a much more diverse set than it would have been, years ago. I know the meme of sort of like camping out at Stanford for the next, PhD student or professor is, go ahead, you will miss most of the deals. That is far from sufficient. It's the random engineer that had nothing to do with AI before and was a C++ database person, and it just turns out that is very relevant towards optimizing models for local inference, which is like a kind of a thing right now. You have to go find that person, and that person does not have the background that you would typically look for. And so it's definitely sort of increased the intensity and the sort of emphasis on coverage, and just sort of, not biasing ourselves towards where people would typically come out of. You got to be really open-minded.
I think that's great. I mean, that it sort of goes back to what Ray was talking about in terms of marrying both the reactive nature of finding, new investments, but also sort of proactively figuring out who is doing what in sort of the broad space that you're looking at. So, I have a somewhat related question to that, which is about time management. So we do a yearly predictions report, and we survey a lot of folks like yourselves, and we ask them how they're going to spend their time the following year. So we did a report. Last year we asked folks how are they going to spend time in 2023, and what folks said was 40% of investors, sourcing was going to be their number one priority, and that's where we'd spend most of the time. And about 30%, it was supporting their portfolio companies. I'm curious how that has panned out, 9 months in, and how are you spending your time right now on that front in terms of sourcing, managing existing portfolio? Curious to hear a little bit about that. Kelly, if you want to start.
Happy to jump in.
Yeah.
I'm laughing as a small firm. I'm like, we spend 100% of our time on all of the jobs, sourcing, fundraising, building the firm, helping our portfolio. But it's an interesting question, and again, maybe a bit skewed given we are a team of operators. We really try to deliver on this commitment to helping early stage founders build foundations for scale. So we do spend a lot of time both trying to build scalable resources, but being available to support our portfolio. And we have 37 different companies that were invested in to date out of this institutional fund. So we do spend a lot of time there. And then in addition, I think from a sourcing perspective, again, we're very network driven. I think one of the things we've seen over the past couple of years, this may be a bit of the hangover from COVID, people are also really hungry for community. So we're doing a lot to just bring together this really talented community of founders, operators, even investors. We actually have an event in the Presidio next door tonight, bringing all those individuals together because we think sort of great things are happening from that. But yes, I think for us, it feels like we're doing all of those things for sure.
That's where the after party is then.
Yes, exactly. Everyone
Great.
come over.
I'd say if you asked me that question in 2022, it would have probably been 80% with his portfolio management and being on boards and really trying to help your portfolios scale, and with customers, with potential hirings, with just a variety of different operational type of tasks, staying very strategic. Now this year, we're obviously back being more active on the sourcing front and looking to deploy capital. And of course, to Kelly's point, not taking our eye off the ball with helping our portfolio CEOs and team companies.
Yeah, it resonated very similarly where I think, up until maybe 3-4 months ago, it felt like a lot more portfolio work, and you can already feel the shift happening where starting to see more deals, especially in that Series B plus growth stage. It's funny how just a few things can change, like with, some IPOs happening in the last few weeks. And I think that just really gets people more excited. We saw big M&A with Splunk, big acquisition. So I think there's now that feeling like things are starting to come back. And so, your job shifts very quickly to like, oh, okay, these 3 companies are raising. How do I prioritize my time to make sure that I'm spending, I only have so many hours in the day. Let me make sure that I'm focused on the right one. So I do feel like that shift is happening almost right now.
Yeah, the portfolio work is interesting. I think, the reason it ends up taking so much time, or it can end up taking so much time, is not because figuring out the problems takes forever. It's actually the kind of conversation with the founders to convince them that this is the set of problems and that actions need to be taken, that it's sort of a campaign you need to run months or quarters in advance of those changes actually happening. And this kind of culmination of all those efforts is what kind of adds up. And so, as other folks were saying, 6-12 months ago, it was a lot of that. And now it's all about AI and finding the next great AI deal. So please, funny how fast things change.
I was going to say, it's amazing how quickly things can change, right? It's like slow, everyone's on vacation. Oh, right away, 100x deals are back. So we shift between 2 extremes.
We've certainly seen that in our users' data. So I'm just kidding. Maybe, one thing I'm curious about is how sort of technology plays a role in all of this. And so over the last few years, we've seen a lot of new firms, come up. And also I think folks realizing generally, how important a great technology and operations strategy is to the success of your firm. So I'm curious, in each of your respective firms, how have you thought about operationalizing your tech stack? What are the types of tools that you're using every day to do what you're doing and spending your time? If you can spend a little bit of time talking about that, that'd be great. Anybody?
I can kick it off.
Cool.
Sure.
Perfect.
So, obviously a big part of our tech stack is Affinity. I do work with PitchBook. I work with various research types of, analysts as well, try to aggregate a lot of reports. You see great blogs like one that Namdi just posted talking about AI governance and compliance, and those things resonate. And so you try to categorize a lot of these things and to pull into your old, landscape of information. And then you start building up, whether it's through PitchBook on lists or your own structures of lists of companies that you're tracking. And then you can start tracking within Affinity each step of the way within your own deal pipeline of the CRM. So for me, that's a easy way of just keeping it kind of steady and straightforward and not like trying to make it too complex. And that's what I like about both Affinity and some of the other tools I use.
Yeah, I think tech-wise, we're probably not too dissimilar from other folks on this stage. But I think one important thing when it comes to kind of operationalizing is sort of engagement by the team with the tools. It's the same thing you're seeing in, by the way, generative AI right now, where the retention, user retention of a lot of these things isn't actually that great because people aren't actually engaging with the tool over the long term. It's the same thing internally. It's just as important to invest in engagement as it is to invest in the tools themselves. And so we spend a lot of time just thinking through, are we actually using this stuff? If not, let's make a change. And so,
Can I ask a follow-up question to that, Namdi?
Yeah.
How have you driven engagement at your firm?
So I'm going to give the answer that all of the business intelligence vendors gives, which is reporting. If you report out of the tool, people will find the tool important. And so, as much as possible, trying to use like Affinity, it's not just sort of at the deal review, kind of pipeline review, it's not just sort of verbalizing the pipeline, but putting it on the screen. Everybody sees that this is where we're tracking everything. And I think that helps to kind of drive a lot of best practices and engagement.
I think I shared a little bit in terms of our process, but maybe to put some detail and color around that. So we took a look at, even over the last 12 to 15 months, we had about 3,500 companies that we actually came our way, that we captured and logged into an Affinity. And then we have our own internal scoring mechanism as to whether or not those companies are a sector fit for us, stage, do they fit we have 4 table stakes criteria that we look at even at a top line to say, does that make sense? Should we move forward with a meeting? And then again, we every other day we meet as a team. Affinity is actually at the center of that. I promise I'm not trying to be a commercial for Affinity, but maybe that's why I got invited to be here. But it's really central to our process. So as a team, that's guiding our conversations, what's moving to the next stage, what's not now that we want to follow up with. And so it's a really important tool set for us to be able to manage that kind of deal flow as a small team. And so that's really central. And then of course we use some other things in terms of our tech stack, from communication, et cetera, obviously how we manage our founder community, but that's really an important part to sort of managing that overall deal process, and that really sourcing, picking, follow-up.
Yeah, I would say, from the engagement perspective, like all the folks here, Affinity is definitely central to what we do, and it's a system of record. It's where we track all of the companies that we're meeting. We'll use some tools around it, but in terms of engagement, I think, in our firm, you might have a set of folks, they tend to be younger, who are using Affinity every day, and then there's a set of folks who are a little older who may not be as engaged. And we found the way to keep everybody on the same page is to run our Monday meeting, our partner meeting on Affinity. So it flashes on the screen. We have our pipeline. We have all the companies that we want to talk about, and then record the notes, in Affinity itself, in that field on the day. So you can't help but look at the screen, right? So, everything is being tracked there. And so if anybody wants to go back and say, do I make a change, or what's happening with that company, it's very available. And I think it's good because it keeps everybody on the same page, and it keeps all of the data in a single place. And so I think that's one way where we've kept the engagement, is at least, hey, every Monday we know for sure people are looking at this.
Wow, thank you for the kind words, folks. I promise we did not talk about this before. Not pay them. No, I'm just kidding. No, thank you so much for. So I have a question looking forward, as you think about evolving what you do from the perspective of how you operationalize your tech stack, right? When you think about the ideal future, of how you're spending your time and where can technology play a role in making your life way better than it is today in terms of, what the things that you're doing, where do you sort of see the biggest areas where technology can contribute?
I had this conversation with some folks at the dinner last night from Affinity, where I was basically saying a lot of VC is like a sales process, right? There's a lot of similarities in terms of finding companies. It's like finding prospects and then nurturing them, and then getting to the point where you're at the table where you can make a deal or invest in a company and with that founder. And so I think a lot of these tools that we use are great. Sometimes they talk to each other well, sometimes they don't. And so when I think about, Affinity and using TGIS and using GLG calls and recording notes, and right now there's a lot of process work that it would be great to have streamlined. And it's funny, when we invest in some sales tech companies, I look at the sales tech and I'm like, oh, that's a really smart process. We should do that. Why should I spend time copying notes from one application to another when that could happen automatically for me? And so I think, at the end of the day, making the investment is a different decision, but all of the steps leading up to that, I think there are really interesting ways that could be streamlined that almost mirror a sales process, or a really good sales process.
I think the other piece I'd add is, obviously I've shared how we use Affinity from a sourcing and deal flow management perspective, also using in terms of fundraising and, really capturing pertinent notes from LP conversations. I think the third leg of that stool, though, does come down to supporting the portfolio. And I think for us, we do a lot of work to have that trusted relationship. We, hopefully are often that first call. We've built a really robust network of operators that jump in to help founders. But I think the thing that keeps me up at night is a lot of that activity is pretty reactive. I mean, on one hand, we want to be founder-led. On the other, we're continually thinking about what are some of those triggers that we could put in place. I mean, you do see some essentially repeatable behavior in those early stages of company building. So how could we automate as we're collecting sort of quarterly information? Now's a really nice time to introduce X or introduce this resource. And I think that's certainly something that technology could help us with that we're not really leaning on technology for today.
Yeah, the thing I think about is sort of, especially in the context of everything that's happening around generative AI, is sort of like creativity on demand. That's what these systems are very good at. They are somewhat good at getting you the final answer. They're really good at getting you intermediate answers. And I think the interesting thing about this, if you even kind of broaden the aperture a bit and think about it almost at a societal level, I think there's a lot of worry these days about AI and how it's going to take people's jobs and sort of replace humans in all these ways. But I think there's as many ways in which it sort of does things that humans weren't doing before, right? It's like I had a friend the other day who was brainstorming startup names and used ChatGPT to come up with a few names. That's just not a service that existed before. That's just a net new innovation that now makes that individual's life better. And I think there's analogies of this in all sorts of places, even as an investor. And so that's probably what I'm most excited about.
Yeah, I'll add on that, like, we're a small team. I don't have a set of analysts or associates to work with. So a lot of what I do is I'm the one doing the cold outreach or the warm outreach or the sourcing. And so speeding up a lot of that process for me is going to be really, really game changing. And so if I think about Gen AI and thinking about how that can really help with a cold email, or how Affinity can work with LinkedIn to really somehow connect the people database to the company database and really help me from that standpoint, I think there's a lot of gain. Ray, you hear that? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's great. Be a part of a keynote. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I do. So I think those are going to be some ways to over time to make the job a lot easier, because it is a lot of work to go from one step to the other and have a thoughtful way to reach out to founders.
Makes a lot of sense. So maybe shifting gears a little bit, talking about portfolio support. Kelly, you started to talk about this in terms of how you have a robust process. I mean, the jury's still out. I think, we're starting to see some IPOs, but, a lot of the path to an exit for companies that are running our portfolios may still be uncertain. So I'm curious how you're thinking about portfolio success today. What is your biggest focus area as it concerns, related to the health of your portfolio companies? And Kelly, maybe let's start with...
Happy to jump in. I think one of the things that's changed, and again, we're pre-seed and seed, so we'll reconnect in 10 years and I'll let you know how the portfolio did. But I think one of the things that we see is even 18 months ago, you could invest at the pre-seed and seed, and founders had a little time to do what I call wander around in the woods and kind of figure it out. And like, what exactly am I building? And I think one of the big differences are, and we laugh about this, that we're like, congratulations on closing your funding round. Okay, when's the next funding round? What are the milestones you need to reach? What's going to get in the way? Like, let's figure out right now what that roadmap is. And oh, by the way, let's put some padding in, because not everything's going to go as planned. So we do a lot out of the gate to hopefully, partner with that founder and help them think through what that roadmap is. And we really stress, a couple things. I think being really crystal clear on who your customer is and who you're building for. I think that's really important in terms of all the AI companies we're seeing as well. We're seeing some interesting tech, and they're still trying to figure out where to apply it. I mean, the danger in that is that I think in this market, you have to really look for that market pull and momentum. That's certainly what we see, at least where we sit, Series A, B investors being particularly interested in. So we talk a lot about that customer. Where are they seeing that market pull? Is that repeatable? We also see sometimes founders do feel the crunch to show revenue. They're like, oh, I can go get some revenue over here. And I'm like, well, that's potentially not central to your business or potentially not repeatable. So you're not going to get any credit for that. So do not get distracted by that revenue stream. Let's make sure you're staying really focused on the core business, one roadmap, and what needs to get done. And so that's a lot of our conversation at the onset, and how that differs a bit from probably 2 years ago.
Yeah, I think picking up on the the fundraising point, I think this is where we end up spending kind of a lot of time, because there's sort of a whole cohort of founders that have only been in the valley during this period of extremely high valuations and sort of blockbuster fundraises, and that environment has changed materially. I think one thing that is sort of tricky for them to understand is that in this ecosystem, there are these rising tides that lift all boats, and then when they go away, everyone is left out to dry. In other words, capital flows affect valuations, and so when that capital goes away, when that investor demand disappears, it creates a very different environment where it's not just that, oh, I'm going to raise, but the valuation is going to be lower. It's that you might not raise at all, like a 0-1 binary thing, and that existential potential is something that a lot of folks don't understand until they get to the fundraise. And so if you can help them understand that as early as possible, I think it's super important.
So yeah, I was just thinking, like, if you look back a couple of years ago in 2021, most of the deals I was going after were being preempted. And so it was, you get to talk to the founder and they're like, yeah, sorry, you just missed out. And so that happened quite often in 21. And then 22 was a different story. There was, I'd say, less deals getting done. And so you saw more bridge rounds. You saw some other, you just didn't see as many deals, obviously, given we all know a lot less capital got deployed, mostly because a lot of deals were preempted in 2021 too. So now today we're seeing a combination back. It feels a bit more normal with fundraises, funding-led priced rounds to bridge extensions. Surprisingly, I'm not seeing as many down rounds as I thought I would at this point, but we'll see how this continues on.
Yeah, and I'll jump to the later stage side of the equation where we've got a handful of companies that are in that later stage bucket, and you're right. They look at Klaviyo and they're like, "Oh, Klaviyo IPO'd. I mean, this market's open, right?" And it's like, "Hey, you're probably not Klaviyo. Like, there's a, and that's okay. I think there's a good tweet by Jason Lemkin or something. He's like, Klaviyo has all these top 1% metrics. Chances are you're probably not as good as them on these metrics, and that's okay. And so I think it's just a sort of a little bit of a rationality of saying, okay, how do you get to where they are? You might not IPO in the next 6 months, even if the market is open and the window's open, but how do we make sure that the business is, where something like that is, which is like, great growth, but also has a path to profitability and is in a great market and all those kinds of things. So I think that is, we do see people like, oh, market's open. It's like, yeah, but hey, we still have a few steps to get to where they are.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I've heard the Klaviyo story pretty, loudly from our investors too. So, so I have a question about fundraising. Your own fundraising. Of course, I mean, it's not a surprise that, raising money from LPs, new and existing LPs, getting harder, the higher interest rate environment. So I'm just curious, what are you noticing, seeing, either in your own firm or broadly in the market, in terms of what that approach is going to look like in terms of raising new funds for venture firms and private equity firms, and are there any unique challenges or things that you're seeing folks do differently in this market environment?
One thing that struck me recently, so as Curtis was mentioning, I put up some content pieces here and there, and a lot of them focus on some of these dynamics around the venture market and ecosystem and how things are kind of evolving over time. And we had our annual kind of LP summit a couple months back, and I was shocked by how many of our LPs had been reading my stuff and how it was influencing their thinking about the kind of venture macro environment. Like, they love this stuff. It is like, they're very thoughtful about it. And so I don't know if it's not so much an answer to your question about how are things changing, but I would say the LPs are paying attention, and they're making moves in different directions to account for the kind of changing venture market, for sure.
Yeah, we're not fundraising or anything right now. We just announced 2 new funds last year, but I would say from summer now from conversations with LPs and in our summits and annual general meetings and all these things, I think they certainly are very discerning, right? And probably more discerning than in the last few years. And I think they're starting to see, hey, if you had a fund for a long time and you didn't have distributions in the last few years, that's a bit of a question, right? Given where the market's been at. And so I think that most LPs have always been very, very thoughtful about things. And I think there's another level of, hey, let me see what you've really done over the last few years. It's not just markups anymore, and it's not just, hey, I invested in this hot company and they got marked up 5 times. Well, we all know that doesn't really mean anything until they exit, or what's the path to an exit. And I think all those questions are things that, if we didn't get them before, we're getting more of now.
First of all, I think I realized as I made this move to venture, I will now be fundraising for the rest of my life. So I think always ABC or ABF, always be fundraising. One of the things that's really different for us, so for our first fund, we raised it entirely during COVID. It was all Zoom. And there's a couple of things happening. I think, one, we've really set out to build a multi-generational firm. So we're looking for LPs and partners that want to be with us for the next fund, and hopefully many more in the future. And of course, I'm stating the obvious, but what that means are really long-term relationships. And how do you build those relationships and nurture them over many touch points? And now for us, including getting on airplanes and meeting people in person, which is great. But I think the other thing, and the stream of consciousness part, is as an emerging fund or emerging manager, I think it's going to be an interesting next couple of years. I think, unfortunately, we're going to see a number of emerging funds and managers potentially not continue on, that there won't be as much capital in the system to support small funds, emerging managers. You can feel that in some of our conversations. Some investors, and I appreciate this, are trying to be very loyal and dedicated to those funds they've already invested in. They're not maybe looking to put in new slots, or others are kind of questioning, like, what is the longevity of new funds or new entrants over the past couple of years. But that's top of mind for me for a number of reasons, because I think we need more managers and diverse sources of capital, and it's going to be an interesting time for us. But overall, I think the fundraising pieces, I think we'll always be sourcing, we'll always be fundraising, we'll also hopefully always be human, and that's a really big part of it, and we're really focused on how do we create those meaningful relationships.
Yeah, I would just echo the sentiment of the panelists. I think everybody made really great points, which is why I went last, so I didn't have to say a lot on this topic. But I would just make a general comment that, I think LPs are looking for more. They're deploying less into much larger funds, and they're going more special focused funds. I mean, if you looked at F7's thesis, it's like a really dynamic thesis around group of operators bringing something different from each point of view, which resonates, I think, with a lot of different types of investors right now today. But in general, you'll find that is very true right now with how fundraising is going.
Makes a ton of sense. So I have one final question to conclude the panel, which is 2024 is coming up. It's right around the corner. And so as you're thinking about the next few months, the next year, and maybe this is bleeding into a prediction survey, but what are some predictions you're making, or what is one bold prediction, I guess, you're making about 2024 in terms of how things may be similar or different than 2023? And we'll start with you, Curtis.
Don't take mine.
I know.
Glad I'm going last.
I honestly think 2024 will be a lot like 2023. That's my hot take. I think everyone's seeing what's happening in the macros, and it's just my opinion. It's just going to be patient with regards to the venture market and how things continue to grow. And I'm expecting a lot of companies to look for opportunities to do runway extensions, and then to get to a point where they're really excited about their next fundraise and to try to really expand.
I was going to say, I think 2024 is going to be an incredible year for companies in innovation. I think we've, have a couple moments we can look back on with the advent of big platforms or other companies. If you think about companies that spun out of Google and Google Maps, if that's Uber, Waze, if you think about companies that spun out of the Facebook platform and built on the open graph from Salesforce, Udemy, multiple billion-dollar companies. I think we're going to have that moment now with what we're seeing with AI, with ChatGPT, with these tools being more accessible. So I am super excited to be an early stage investor in 2024 and beyond. I think it's going to be really exciting.
Yeah, I have a similar answer, kind of framed in the context of some of the discussions around going public. It's sort of like at any given time period, you think about there's a certain number of kind of slots for public companies. In most spaces, they're sort of calcified. It's hard to grow up in those ecosystems. The incumbents are very strong. It's hard to go from zero to IPO in those spaces. Suddenly you have one of these structural shifts where it kind of creates, X number of new potential public companies that could start off as a seed investment by a venture firm. I think a lot of that will have to do with AI. This will be the last time I mention AI, I promise. And so it's a very important time as an investor if you kind of think about it that way, because now is the time to put the money in the company that will eventually do that. And that time does not exist in all periods. So another form of being excited for next year.
I'll mention AI because I'm going last, I guess. We have to have one more mention of AI. I think what I'm excited about is seeing really durable AI companies and products emerge and get funded. I think, this year, I think of when ChatGPT, we're almost coming on the first year of ChatGPT being released, and it was exciting to see all these new products that got built and created, and companies and funding went in the space. And as Namdi kind of mentioned, like we're finding a lot of that initial euphoria, a lot of that retention wasn't as great as we thought. And there's a lot of experimental budgets. But I think next year, with the tools and the infrastructure and the companies and products we have in place in AI, I think we're going to see some really giant companies being created and incepted and funded. And I'm really excited to see that in 2024.
Awesome. Well, all wise words. Here's to celebrating some innovation in 2024 and some great durable AI companies. Thank you very much for being here and for being part of this panel. And thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.